I've spent countless hours poring over old case files, but nothing prepared me for the chilling twists in this one. This isn't just another cold case. It's a puzzle that has haunted investigators for decades, a puzzle that has refused to stay buried. Imagine for a moment, going back in time to a quiet suburban neighborhood where the world seems safe, predictable, and untouched by the shadows of true crime. And then, out of nowhere, everything changed. A brutal crime shook the community to its core. A crime so devastating that even now, decades later, people whisper about it as though the victim's voice still echoes through the streets. The story begins in the late 1980s. A young woman named Catherine Hayes was found murdered in her own home. She was bright, ambitious, loved by her neighbors, and had dreams of becoming a journalist. But one evening, those dreams were cut short. Catherine was found lying on the floor of her living room, the scene chaotic but oddly staged. To this day, police reports note how strangely deliberate it all felt. Furniture had been knocked over but not broken. A single glass of wine sat untouched on the table, and there were no signs of forced entry. The most haunting detail? A handwritten note that read, "You weren't supposed to be here." What does that even mean? Who left it? Was it a stranger or someone Catherine knew all too well? I want you to think about that as we dive deeper. If someone you trusted was capable of such horror, would you even see it coming? The initial investigation moved quickly, but almost too quickly. Police interviewed Catherine's neighbors, her coworkers, her family. They looked into boyfriends and acquaintances, but every lead dried up. Fingerprints on the wine glass didn't match anyone in their database. The note, written in messy block letters, gave nothing away. And as weeks turned into months, the case began to grow cold. The community, once shaken, tried to move forward, but a shadow remained. Everyone knew a killer was still out there. Decades later, Catherine's name was nearly forgotten until new technology resurfaced the case.
Decades later, something extraordinary happened. Catherine Hayes' case file, dusty and buried deep in the archives, was reopened by a newly formed cold case unit. Why? Because advances in forensic technology had given investigators tools that simply didn't exist back in the 80s. DNA testing had evolved. Digital forensics could analyze even degraded evidence, and artificial intelligence was being used to identify patterns in old data. Suddenly, Catherine's case wasn't just a forgotten tragedy, it was an opportunity for justice. The turning point came when one detective, a relentless investigator named Mark Ellison, pulled out the evidence box. Inside, sealed in a faded plastic bag, was the very note that had been found beside Catherine's body. Back then, handwriting analysis was crude, and DNA testing was in its infancy. But now experts could scan for the smallest skin cells or sweat residue left on the paper. And after decades of silence, the note finally spoke. Tiny DNA fragments were extracted from the edges of the paper, fragments that didn't belong to Catherine. This was it, the first real lead in over 30 years. But here's the unsettling part. The sample didn't match anyone in the National DNA Database. Whoever had written that note had managed to slip through the cracks all these years. So, who was it? Investigators began retracing every step of Catherine's life. They dug through old police reports, revisited neighbors who were now older, grayer, and in some cases, gone. But one thing became clear. The crime scene had always been strange. There were no forced doors or broken locks, suggesting Catherine might have known her killer. Did she let them in willingly? And if so, why? Then came another breakthrough. The untouched wine glass, which had seemed like a useless piece of evidence back in the 80s, was re-examined. Modern forensic tools revealed a faint fingerprint smudge, barely visible, degraded by time, but still there. It wasn't Catherine's. It wasn't anyone in the household. This was the fingerprint of a stranger. I want you to picture this. A killer standing in Catherine's living room, pouring a glass of wine and leaving behind just enough of themselves to be discovered decades later. Isn't it chilling to think that the smallest mistakes, the smudge of a finger, the trace of DNA, can outlast someone's attempt to erase their crime? And yet, despite this progress, the suspect's identity still remained a mystery. The DNA, the fingerprint, neither matched any known criminal, which raised a terrifying question. Was this person still out there? Never caught, never even suspected? Could they have committed other crimes just as carefully hidden? Detective Ellison wasn't willing to stop. He started analyzing Catherine's circle once again. Friends, co-workers, neighbors. And then he uncovered something overlooked the first time. In the weeks before her death, Catherine had been investigating a story. Remember, she wanted to be a journalist. She had been working on something privately, something her co-workers never fully knew about. Could it be that her death was tied not to her personal life, but to what she was uncovering? If Catherine was silenced because she was getting too close to the truth, then the crime wasn't random. It was calculated.
When Detective Ellison stumbled upon Catherine's private notes, tucked away in a faded leather journal kept by her family, everything began to shift. Inside were fragments of interviews, cryptic observations, and half-finished leads. Catherine had been investigating something she only ever called the silent deal. But what was it? A business scandal? A local corruption case? Or something far more dangerous? One note read, "They meet on Thursdays. Always the same bar. No one looks at each other, but the tension is thick. Must dig deeper." Another line, hastily scribbled, said, "If I disappear, it's because I got too close." That single sentence sent chills through the cold case team. Had Catherine predicted her own fate? Think about that for a moment. A young woman, barely in her 20s, sitting in a smoky bar with her notebook, observing people she shouldn't have been watching. If she realized she was in danger, why didn't she stop? Was she too ambitious? Too brave? Or simply unaware of how serious the threat really was? The team cross-referenced Catherine's notes with public records, and shockingly, Thursday nights at that bar did align with quiet meetings between three men, all of whom had deep ties to city contracts and politics back then. They weren't officially linked, but their presence kept showing up together. One of them had even been questioned during the original investigation, though nothing concrete tied him to Catherine. Could it be that she uncovered something they wanted buried forever? Then came whispers from the past. An anonymous tip landed on the detective's desk, claiming Catherine had been warned to stop digging. The caller's voice was shaky, elderly, perhaps a retired insider finally trying to ease their conscience. They said Catherine had asked too many questions about mismanaged city funds, shady land deals, and the people who profited quietly from the chaos. Was she silenced to keep those secrets hidden? At the same time, the forensic evidence took another strange turn. The DNA pulled from the note matched partially with a family line in a genealogical database. Suddenly, detectives weren't looking for a specific person, they were looking at a family tree. This meant the killer, or someone related to them, might finally be within reach. But it also meant re-examining suspects' relatives, neighbors, even people who were just kids back then. Here's where it gets even more unsettling. One branch of that family tree intersected with someone who worked at the bar Catherine visited, the very bar where she wrote those chilling observations. Coincidence or connection? And as the case gained media attention, survivors from that era began coming forward with details they had long buried. One woman admitted she saw Catherine speaking with a man in a dark coat outside the bar the night before her death. Another said she remembered hearing Catherine mention something big she was about to reveal, but she never had the chance. What if Catherine's murder wasn't a random act of violence, but a carefully staged message? What if her death was meant to warn others, stay silent, or pay the price? The renewed investigation wasn't just piecing together evidence,
It was unraveling the web of fear that had kept people quiet for decades. But the deeper Ellison and his team dug, the more resistance they faced. Records went missing, old colleagues refused to talk, and even now, some doors remain closed. So let me ask you, if a cold case suddenly started pointing toward powerful figures who are still alive today, would justice truly be allowed to prevail? Or would history repeat itself, silencing the truth once again?
The focus now shifted to the suspects, the men Catherine may have been circling in her notes. Decades had passed, but their names still carried weight in the city. One was a retired politician, another a wealthy contractor, and the third a quiet man who had lived in the same neighborhood for years, almost invisible to the public eye. At first glance, they seemed untouchable, but Catherine's words had dragged their shadows back into the light. Detective Ellison began retracing Catherine's steps, following the path she had marked so long ago. She had written about Thursday meetings at that bar, but what was said in those hushed conversations? Could a young woman overhearing fragments of dialogue really have uncovered something so dangerous? The answer might lie in the people who had served them drinks, cleaned their tables, and watched silently from the edges. The team located an elderly bartender who had worked there at the time. His memory was hazy, but he recalled Catherine vividly, her confidence, her determination, and her habit of sitting alone, pretending to sip a single drink for hours while scribbling in her notebook. He also remembered something chilling, the way the three men always grew quieter when she entered, their eyes darting to her corner. "They noticed her," he whispered. "I'm sure of it." But which of them had taken the step from suspicion to violence? The new DNA evidence complicated the puzzle further. It didn't directly match any of the three men, but instead led to a relative, a younger man connected by blood, the contractor's nephew. Back in the day, he worked as a low-level employee at the bar. He would have had the perfect opportunity to overhear Catherine, to approach her when she left, to silence her before she could reveal anything. And then came the breakthrough, an old police report buried in the archives, overlooked for decades. It described a scuffle near the alley behind the bar, the same night Catherine disappeared. A witness had reported a young man in a dark coat arguing with a woman. But back then, the description was dismissed as too vague, too inconclusive. Now it matched perfectly with what the elderly witness had just revealed. Imagine the horror of realizing that Catherine may have walked straight into her killer's arms that night, unaware that she was already marked. If she truly had evidence that threatened powerful men, was this nephew acting alone? Or was he acting as someone's protector, someone higher up who needed her silenced? These questions ignited fierce debates among investigators and viewers alike. Was this a case of a young man panicking and lashing out? Or was it an orchestrated hit carried out to keep secrets hidden? And here's where the suspense deepens. If the nephew was involved, why was his name never mentioned in the original files? Was it incompetence or a deliberate cover-up? Could the investigators at the time have been pressured to ignore certain leads? Think about it. How many cases like this get buried not because of lack of evidence, but because of who that evidence points to? The community, now reawakened by media coverage, was buzzing with speculation. Families whispered about the possibility that justice had been intentionally delayed. Some even questioned whether Catherine's murder was just one piece of a larger puzzle, a corruption scandal so vast that silencing her was merely a first step. The trail was growing warmer, but danger loomed. If Catherine had been silenced for asking questions, what might happen to those trying to expose the truth now? So let me ask you, if you were a detective holding these pieces in your hands, would you risk pushing forward, knowing it could shatter lives and reputations still intact today? Or would you hesitate, afraid to stir ghosts that some want to remain buried forever?
The case was no longer just about Catherine. It was about the silence that had followed her death, the silence of a town that had buried its shame, The silence of officials who had quietly filed her disappearance under unsolved and moved on. But silence never lasts forever. Her family had carried the weight for decades. Catherine's younger brother, now in his 70s, described how their parents had died without answers, how the family home still held her untouched room, a shrine to a life stolen too soon. When the new investigation made headlines, he spoke with a tremor in his voice. All these years, we were told it was just bad luck, that she was in the wrong place at the wrong time. But Catherine wasn't unlucky. She was targeted. That statement cut through the investigation like a knife. If Catherine was targeted, then someone made a choice, a conscious decision to extinguish her light. The nephew now stood at the center of suspicion. But why had the original investigators avoided him? New whispers suggested that the contractor, his uncle, had friends in high places. Friends who could make inconvenient names disappear from police reports. A cover-up, however small, could explain why the scuffle in the alley was never pursued. And once you see a cover-up in one corner of a case, you start to wonder how far its shadows reach. Detective Ellison pulled out the old crime scene photos again, laying them beside Catherine's diary pages. Something struck her. Catherine had written, "They're scared. One slip and it all comes out." What slip had she meant? Was she referring to a deal, a contract, a bribe? If she had even one document, one note tying those men to corruption, it could have been enough to justify murder. And here's where the story grows darker. Forensic analysts discovered faint, long faded ink on the back of one of Catherine's diary pages, like she had scribbled a name and hastily crossed it out. Under special lighting, the name became legible. Not the uncle, not the politician, but the nephew. It raised a chilling possibility. Had Catherine noticed him watching her, following her? Had she realized too late that the real threat wasn't the powerful men at the table, but their silent shadow in the corner? The town, once quiet, was suddenly alive with tension. News vans crowded the streets. Locals debated in diners and church basements on front porches. Some wanted the truth at any cost. Others muttered warnings that the past should stay buried. Digging this up will only bring more pain. Some ghosts don't rest. But for Catherine's family, there was no rest until justice was found. The prosecutor's office now had a decision to make. Was there enough to press charges against the nephew after so many decades? DNA, eyewitnesses, a scuffle, the diary, it all built a compelling picture. Yet the defense would argue memories fade, reports were sloppy, nothing was conclusive. And that's the haunting twist. Just when it seemed the truth was finally within reach, legal experts warned this case could collapse in court. Imagine the heartbreak. Catherine's family waiting 50 years for justice, only to see it crumble because the past was left to rot for too long. So the investigators faced a choice. Push ahead and risk losing it all in trial, or hold back, building the case inch by inch, even if it meant waiting longer. The weight of that choice mirrored the one Catherine herself faced decades ago. Stay silent and safe, or speak out and risk everything. She chose courage, and now, so many years later, others were being asked to do the same. The air was thick with one question. If this cover-up went as deep as it seemed, who else had blood on their hands?
The courthouse was packed. Some people had driven in from towns 2 counties away just to witness what they called the reckoning. Journalists filled the front rows, their cameras poised, their notebooks open. Catherine's family sat silently in the gallery, their hands folded tightly, eyes locked on the empty chair where the accused would soon sit. The nephew, now an aging man in his 60s, walked in slowly, his face pale, his jaw clenched. For the first time, he was no longer just a shadow in an old file. He was the defendant. The prosecution wasted no time. They laid out Catherine's diary, the newly tested DNA, the account of the surviving witness who had heard the scuffle in the alley, and the damning note, scribbled and scratched out, his name. This isn't coincidence, the prosecutor declared. This is the trail of evidence, ignored for decades, pointing to one man. But the defense was ready. They struck at the weakness of time. "Ladies and gentlemen," the attorney said, pacing the floor, "you are being asked to convict a man based on fragments of memory, on faded ink, on theories. Decades have passed. Can you trust the accuracy of a single witness from so long ago? Can you trust a piece of paper that may have been tampered with? This is not justice. This is desperation." And suddenly, the trial was no longer just about Catherine. It was about whether the truth could survive half a century of silence. Witness after witness took the stand. Some faltered, their voices cracking as they admitted their memories blurred. Others spoke with certainty, recalling strange behavior from the nephew, late-night visits to the construction site where Catherine was last seen. One man swore he saw the nephew burning something in a barrel behind the family's property the very night Catherine disappeared. The most dramatic moment came when Catherine's diary was displayed on the projector for the jury. Page after page, her voice echoed through the courtroom. Her words painted a portrait of fear, of suspicion, of a young woman who knew she was being watched. And then the scrawled name. Faded, yes, but under forensic lighting, there was no mistaking it. The nephew shifted uncomfortably in his chair. He avoided eye contact. He wiped his forehead with a trembling hand. The prosecution leaned in. If he was innocent, why did Catherine name him? Why did she scratch it out, as if afraid someone would find it? This isn't coincidence. This is fear, written in ink. The defense countered with force. A scratched-out note? That's your smoking gun? That could be anyone's handwriting. That could be anyone's name. You cannot convict a man based on a shadow of ink. And here's where the tension reached its peak. The judge allowed the jury to see not just the diary, but the enhanced forensic scans. Gasps filled the courtroom. Some jurors leaned forward, visibly shaken. The trial stretched on for days. Each night, news anchors dissected every testimony, every piece of evidence. The nation tuned in. Catherine's story, once forgotten, was now a headline. But still, the verdict hung in the balance. Finally, the closing arguments came. The prosecutor looked the jury in the eyes and said, "Catherine's voice was stolen when she was silenced, but through her words, she speaks again. Will you listen to her, or will you let her killer walk free once more?" The defense rose, smooth and composed. "Don't let sympathy cloud reason. The burden is on the state, and they have not proven guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. Don't punish an innocent man just because time has blurred the truth." The jury left to deliberate. Hours turned into a full day. Reporters speculated wildly. Catherine's family sat frozen, their lives hanging in the balance of 12 strangers. And then the announcement came. The jury had reached a verdict. As they filed back into the courtroom, the air felt heavy, as if everyone was holding the same breath. The foreman stood, paper in hand. The judge asked the question the world was waiting for. On the charge of murder in first degree, how do you find the defendant? The foreman cleared his throat, looked down, and began to speak.
The foreman's voice wavered for just a moment, then steadied as he read the words that would echo through the courtroom and beyond. "We, the jury, find the defendant guilty." The silence was deafening. For a split second, it was as if time froze. Catherine's family gasped, tears spilling as they clutched each other's hands. In the gallery, reporters scrambled to type, their phones buzzing as they sent the breaking news across the country. The cold case that had haunted generations was no longer cold. The nephew slumped in his chair, his face pale as the weight of the verdict settled on him. He shook his head, muttering under his breath, as if trying to convince himself this wasn't real. The defense attorney placed a hand on his shoulder, whispering something about appeals, but the look in the man's eyes was one of defeat. The judge's gavel struck. Order in the court, his voice cut through the chaos. The defendant is hereby remanded into custody to await sentencing. Outside, the courthouse steps became a stage for history. News anchors stood in front of cameras, announcing that after more than half a century, justice had finally caught up with Catherine's killer. Some called it the triumph of science, others the persistence of memory. But everyone agreed it was justice long delayed, but not denied. Yet even in this moment of victory, questions lingered. Had the whole truth really been revealed? Some wondered if others had been involved, if secrets still lay buried under layers of silence and fear. Others whispered that the guilty verdict was more symbolic than certain, that time had muddled too much to ever be completely sure. But for Catherine's family, one thing mattered above all else. Her name was no longer just a headline in a forgotten file. Her story had been heard, her voice restored. After decades of echoes in the dark, the truth had spoken loud enough to shake an entire town. And now I turn to you. Do you believe the jury made the right decision? Was this true justice or a desperate attempt to close a chapter that had haunted too long? Share your thoughts in the comments, because every perspective matters in a case like this. If this story gripped you the way it gripped me, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe to Criminal Codex, and ring the bell so you never miss the next dive into the mysteries that refuse to stay buried. Until next time, stay curious, stay safe, and remember, some echoes from the past never truly fade.